If you're reading a book or watching a movie or consuming a story or anything that's been written, any cultural text, if you're consuming anything that's been done in the past that has stood the test of time and it's great and lots of smart people regard it as great, and there are elements in it where you look at it your first time through it and you're going, what is that? I don't really understand why we're doing that. I don't like it. The best assumption is that all the smart people who think it's really good are probably right, and there's a reason it stood the test of time. That said, I used to think that Nehemiah and Ezra and other parts of the Old Testament were real boring because they boringly repeated stuff. I don't like repetition. I remember, I don't know if it was the first time I read it, maybe it was the second time, third time I went through this, but at some point when I was younger and I was reading through Ezra and Nehemiah as a kid, I remember having it click, like, hey, wait a minute, Nehemiah 7, I already read all of this material in that exact order. This is just a repeat. This is Control-C, Control-V. I mean, they didn't have that when I was a kid, but you know what I mean? It's just a repeat. It's a carbon copy of something that happened earlier. And what are we doing? Trying to pad the page count here? And then a little bit of time goes by, and I've read through it a few more times since then. I've thought about it a few more times since then. And now I get it more, I think. I'm understanding why this great big block of repeated material in Nehemiah chapter 7, that's a repeat of Ezra chapter 2, is here. And I think one of the biggest reasons that we get this big block of repeat is because one of the central themes of Ezra and Nehemiah is remembrance. How do you remember things? You repeat it. How do you know what ought to be remembered? Well, it gets repeated more than once, so you can tell that it is being emphasized. And Nehemiah chapter 7 isn't the last time that in the book of Nehemiah, we're going to get a repetition of things from earlier in the Bible, either spelled out for us or referenced that it was spelled out for people back then. But still, this one is, it's carbon copy, chapter 2 of Ezra and Nehemiah, chapter 7. What it is, it's the, what do I even want to call this? It's the census. It's the list of all of the people who made the trip back with Zerubbabel in 538 BC when Cyrus was king, way back in the day, almost 100 years before the events we're reading about here. So over in Ezra 2, you get a list of everybody who was brave enough to drop their stuff and leave their comfortable Persian living. And it was good, I think, for the Jewish exiles after Cyrus came along. I think Persia, it was really clear they were going to be a lot nicer to work with, much more pleasant. And maybe it would make sense to just kind of hang out and see who Cyrus is and how this goes. The big cities of Persia are really, really nice. I mean, these are places that a lot of people would give an arm and a leg to live in today. They were marvelous places filled with wealth and public works. And really up until, 100, maybe 120 years ago, these would have been some of the nicest places on earth even 120 years ago. These were amazing towns. And so it really did take a lot of courage to leave these great population centers in Persia where the Jews were thriving and making tons of money. It took a ton of courage for them to get up and go back to a city that was torn down and overgrown with weeds, where they would basically be starting over like settlers or frontiersmen going across the Great Plains and heading west on the Oregon Trail to go build some filthy little hovel they would be scraping out an existence in. They really were the tip of the spear for the rebuilding effort, and it took courage. So Ezra notes that in Ezra chapter 2, and he gives us this breakdown that goes something like this. I'm not going to read all of it because I read all of it back in the summary of Ezra at the beginning of this season. It goes like this. The list of the men of the people of Israel, the descendants of Parash, 2,172. Of Shephatiah, 372. Of Arah, 775. Of Pahath Moab, through the line of Jeshua and Joab, 2,812. Of Elam, 1,254. Of Zatu, 945, and so on and so forth. And then those are all the families, and then it breaks it down into cities. It says the men of Bethlehem, and it gives you some of those. And it says the priests and the Levites and the singers and the temple servants and Solomon's servants. And it gives you this whole rundown of all the people who came and how many people were a part of the original journey from Susa and the east all the way back to Jerusalem. And then we get this one little bit, and you might remember when we discussed it because it stands out as being kind of odd. There were people who jumped in with the baggage train and the procession and were holding themselves out as being ethnically, historically Jewish. But whoever wrote down this genealogy wasn't so sure. Ezra 2:59. The following came up from the towns of Tel Malah, Tel Harsha, Kerub, Adon, and Immer, but they could not show that their families were descended from Israel. Those were the descendants of Deliah, Tobiah, and Nekoda. Remember, this is 100 years almost ago, so it's not the Tobiah who has been a pain in the butt for Nehemiah and his buddies, somebody else. And from among the priests, and then he lists off a bunch of priests who, they had questionable genealogies. Maybe they're not a part of the inheritance. Well, that, my friends, is what gets repeated in Nehemiah 7. Now, what's the most boring part of the book of Ezra? I'm flipping through it right now, and it's the list of names. That's the boringest. There's no drama. You got to pick at it a whole bunch to get down to the meaning in it. And if it's not that first list of names, it's the other two lists of names that you get in Ezra. So it's going to stand out because you got to labor to get through Ezra chapter 2 and really get into the juice of the story. Same thing in Nehemiah. What's the boringest part? What's this list of names? And so it would be real easy to skip over it because you skipped over Ezra chapter 2 and never notice that they're basically identical all the way down to the census numbers and all the way down to the people who tried to jump in with the questionable genealogies. Because remember, all of this great big giant census, this list of names in Nehemiah 7, is in the service of telling the reader about how Nehemiah brought about the repopulation of the newly rebuilt city of Jerusalem, how he got the metaphorical aquarium fish into the metaphorical beautiful aquarium. This is a very intentional, direct repetition of all of these names, and it all adds up to a great big giant number of people who made the trip in the first place, and it brings us back to the question, why is he repeating this? I picked through all of it. Maybe you'll catch some differences I didn't catch, but it looks like he's just saying the same stuff. Why? Well, I think he's making a case. I think he's justifying who he is going to push to have ideal property in Jerusalem. I think he's making a case for why certain families are more entitled to be the trendsetters and anchor families of this new Jerusalem that is being built and repopulated. And I think he's also making a case, going back to a census that people agreed with 100 years ago. I think he's also making a case that some of these people who might want to claim on Jerusalem just frankly can't demonstrate clearly enough that they're a part of this family, that they're the descendants of Abraham, to justify bumping some other family out to get them in. I think he's also giving us this list to kind of retroactively defend who he appointed as gatekeepers, singers, and Levites at the beginning of chapter 7, the idea being that anything you can do to fill Jerusalem and see that Jerusalem is led by people who have a generational investment in this thing, well, that's going to bring about the best results. Sure, there could be nameless upstarts who kind of get it and are real excited about it, but Nehemiah is playing it safe, and he is going deep to the well in populating Jerusalem and dividing up, no doubt, land to people who haven't just got it for one generation, but have understood for multiple generations. He also wants there to be a familial payoff. Look, these people took a huge risk. They forfeited wealth back east in big cities that were sure bets to take something that was not a sure bet, and we're going to honor their descendants. Their descendants are going to reap the benefit of the bold moves that their ancestors took 100 years earlier. The whole company numbered 42,360 besides, and then he lists off some people who helped out, men servant, maid servant. He lists the horses and the mules and the donkeys and all of it. It's all accounted for. And then starting in verse 70, Nehemiah gives a little bit of a summary of what is more spelled out in Ezra, talking about who contributed what to the treasury and to the rebuilding of things. And then the final verse, Chapter 7, verse 73, where it says, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, and the temple servants, along with certain of the people and the rest of the Israelites, settled in their own towns. And thus ends the repetition of the old census information dating all the way back to the time of Zerubbabel 100 years earlier. The next phrase that Nehemiah issues is still technically a part of chapter 7, but I think whoever the people were who divided up the verses and chapters and everything would probably like to have this one back, because this really should be part of Nehemiah chapter 8. And in most of your Bibles, the final phrase of chapter 7 is firmly tucked under the subheading of chapter 8, because now we're back into real time, and Nehemiah is using this as sort of a parenthetical closure to say, there you go. That's the repetition. We said it once. We said it again. Those are the people who made the investment when it was risky and hard. Now that it's easy because the work is done, their descendants are going to be the ones who reap the rewards, and we're going to fill Jerusalem with them. Boom. Close parentheses. We're remembering, we're recollecting important things. Final thought of chapter 7 is this: when the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, comma, and now 8:1, all the people assembled as one man in the square before the water gate. And obviously we're going to get into what happens when everybody's done building things and they're all getting back together. What's going to happen? What's going to get said? How is this going to help with the rebuilding of the people? But to put a bow on chapter 7, Nehemiah has fully repeated a thing that everybody agreed upon and was repeated 100 years earlier. That investment was made by risk-takers back then who believed God and knew where they fit in the grand story of things. And the reward for that is going to go to the people who helped see it all the way through to the end, their descendants. And Nehemiah seems to be indicating that those people from that lineage, those are the people who, if he can help it, he wants to populate this new Jerusalem with. He thinks that's going to set it up for the most success. But now, chapter 8 starting, we're back to real time, and there's some kind of meeting that we're going to need to look into next. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but we may have just set a record for the most amount of Bible covered in one day in the history of this podcast. If not, it is real close. Good times. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.